Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for another Research in Focus seminar discussion with a special guest, my good friend and colleague, Professor Alex Bellamy, who is of course the Research Director at the Centre for the Asia Pacific Centre for the Responsibility to Protect and a Chair in Peace and Conflict Studies here in the School of Political Science and International Studies. And today, it's easy to lose track of Alex's many publications. This is, I think, your ninth book, single-authored book by my calculation. But today we'll be discussing his most recent book, which is The Responsibility to Protect Defence, that's come out in late 2004 with Oxford University Press. Alex, thanks for coming along. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to write the book?
Yeah, so the book is basically the combination of years of thinking about and talking about the responsibility to protect. And it's driven by a kind of firm moral belief that the world is better off for having a principle like the responsibility to protect than it would be without a principle like R2P. And R2P is not an academic theory, it's a political principle that's been agreed by all member states in the UN and the General Assembly, reaffirmed by the Security Council. So, in some ways it's imperfect and impure, as all things that are produced by negotiation are, and there are lots of other concepts and doctrines and theories that relate to how we ought to respond to crises of genocide and mass atrocities. But where R2P stands out is that here you have a framework that 193 world leaders have signed up to, that the General Assembly has reaffirmed in multiple resolutions, the Security Council has reaffirmed, and it's been put into practice. So the book is driven by this belief that we have this opportunity in international society to make a difference to how the world responds to problems of genocide and mass atrocities. So we're thinking of cases like Rwanda in '94, where 800,000 people were killed in 100 days, Bosnia, Darfur more recently, and of course the ongoing crisis in Syria, where 200,000 civilians have been killed and more than half the population displaced. So there's an urgent moral imperative around R2P. A lot of work has gone into building this international consensus on R2P. So the purpose of the book is to firstly make a case for why we need an R2P and why R2P is a valuable principle, to defend that case against various criticisms, and think about what some people call the risks of relevance. So as you take a framework like R2P and put it into practice, a whole set of issues, practical issues, operational issues, are thrown up that you can't usually predict in advance. Mm-hmm. A lot of this work is making it up as you go along. Mm-hmm. So trying to identify where those difficulties are and how we might do better in future. Mm. So that's the sort of driving impetus behind the book.
Great. You do go through some of the key operational challenges that you see. Can you take us through those?
Well, the number of actual challenges kind of increases with every new case. I think the thing that's important to kind of emphasise, and it's something the UN Secretary General is emphasising a lot, is that there is no cookie-cutter solution, no one-size-fits-all, and that every case has to be taken on a case-by-case basis. Now, that often gets read by us academics as a kind of a cop-out, throwaway, well, they would say that. But the fact is that each case is different, that the appropriate tools are going to be different in different cases. Different sorts of policies will rub up differently in different sorts of cases. So we need to kind of fine-tune and kind of learn on an ongoing basis. Now, there's three sets of issues that the book identifies that have become particularly apparent since Libya in 2011. Mm-hmm. First relates to how the RTP's focus on protection and protecting populations from mass atrocities sits with other goals such as peacemaking and transitional justice. Mm. Because sometimes the imperative of R2P is just to stop the violence. Mm. And sometimes stopping the violence means that you have to talk to, negotiate, do deals with people who ordinarily you'd rather not do deals with. So, for example, right now in Darfur, the protection of populations from government-backed militia is dependent on the goodwill of the government of Sudan. There is nothing the UN can do without the goodwill of the government of Sudan. Every bit of supplies going to the UN mission there has to go through the port of Sudan. All of it has to clear Sudanese customs. Approval to fly around the country is required from the government of Sudan. Oil supplies are dependent on the government of Sudan. And of course, it's the government of Sudan that can restrain the militia and pull them into line. But the government of Sudan is headed by someone who is indicted by the International Criminal Court for genocide and crimes against humanity. So here you have this crucial tension, which is that on the one hand, UN peacekeepers, day on day, have to cooperate with the government and nudge the government and rely on the government to deliver what protection they can. But on the other hand, you're talking about a government that's deeply implicated and indeed criminally indicted for committing these crimes in the first place. So you have these tensions in that case. It reflects the old tensions of peace versus justice, and that sometimes they don't work in the same direction. Sometimes it is true that the pursuit of criminal justice can make negotiations more difficult. So we know, for example, in 2006-07, when the UN was negotiating with the Lord's Resistance Army, but those negotiations founded on the fact that there was nothing the UN could do to walk back an ICC indictment. So the LRA walked away. Now there are questions about whether they were ever genuine about the negotiations. But there you have a really clear example of how justice and the pursuit of accountability sometimes rubs up against the more immediate needs. And that's a tension that can never be resolved in perfect form. So the book goes through some of the ways in which it can be worked through. But ultimately, institutions like the ICC have to be allowed to do what they do and to create trouble for diplomats and others. And the diplomats and peacekeepers now simply have to work around the dilemmas. So it's something that there is no solution to, but we just need to recognize that sometimes these different issues rub up against each other in complex ways. And the two other operational issues talked about in the book are related to the relationship between R2P and humanitarian action. So very often, and Darfur is another good example, it's humanitarian organizations that are on the front line of protecting populations. One of the untold stories of Darfur is that one of the reasons why the death toll was somewhere between 150 and 200,000 and not much higher is because humanitarian organizations launched one of the most effective humanitarian operations we've ever seen. Housing 2.5 million people in IDP and refugee camps in some of the most remote and inhospitable countries on the planet. So the ability of people to flee violence is absolutely critical to their chances of survival, and it's humanitarian organizations that often provide them with the resources and the ability to do that. So, however we look at it, humanitarian actors play a critical part in protecting populations. But there are significant differences between humanitarianism and the principles of humanitarianism and R2P, most notably that humanitarianism rests on principles of neutrality and impartiality, where R2P is self-consciously partial and not neutral. It takes the side of the victims against the perpetrators. It makes distinctions. And it also, R2P allows for the use of force against those perpetrators in some situations, something that most humanitarian organizations obviously have difficulty with. So again, on the one hand, you have deep complementarity. These two fields of action come from shared normative goals, a shared legal basis, shared aspirations, but in practice, they can rub against each other and more thought is needed. And the book outlines some of the ways in which the relationship between humanitarian action and the political, military, and other sorts of action associated with R2P can be developed. Then, of course, the third area is around this issue of the use of force. And so often R2P gets taken as being synonymous with humanitarian intervention, when in reality, humanitarian intervention or the use of force without the consent of the host state is the most rare form of international engagement in these crises. So, we have one example since 2005, and that was, of course, the UN-authorized operation in Libya. That was one of a dozen situations where the UN is actively involved in crises and using R2P, and was also the first time ever that the Security Council had authorized the use of force for protection purposes against the will of the sovereign state. So these are really very rare. Nobody in the field really expected that the Council would do this so early in the piece in R2P. People were quite surprised that the resolution on Libya was passed, but it was. There were advantages and problems, some successes. A massacre in Benghazi that was widely expected. Even critics of R2P expected a massacre in Benghazi, which is why the resolution went through. That was avoided. The civil war was shortened. For what Libya may have been like, we just need to look at Syria to see that things could have been a lot worse. But clearly there have been issues in implementation, issues with the re-establishment of good governance after the intervention, issues with the implementation of the resolutions itself. And this has, created debate and controversy that need to be tackled head on. As if the Security Council is to get more fully into the business of protection, these issues around accountability and how it operationalizes its mandates will have to be dealt with going forward. So the book talks about that as well.
Yeah, that's. I mean, on that last point about Libya versus Syria, it must be frustrating. I know in the book you do spend a bit of time, not without good reason, on dealing with some of the criticisms. It must be frustrating when R2P is dismissed as dead or fundamentally compromised, when you see instances of some degree of inconsistency in terms of its application, or indeed when you see those operations. It must be frustrating for you in the sense that actually this is probably just the nature of the beast, really, isn't it?
Well, that's right. I mean, I think ever since R2P was born, we've been pronouncing its death. So first, it died within weeks of 2005 because of Darfur. There are two issues that I have with the kind of pronouncements that R2P is dead. Firstly, as an academic issue, is it mistakes how we evaluate whether things are norms or not. So, when we're walking down the street and we witness a murder, as often happens in Brisbane, we don't say, oh, this means that the norm against murder is dead. We say, oh, no, actually that murder was wrong, it violates our shared understanding. So the fact that you have behaviour that doesn't comply with the norm doesn't mean that there isn't a norm. Instead, what we need to look at is how the society reacts. And R2P has two sets of norms. One is about how states treat their own populations, and the other is about how the international community responds. Now, if R2P was dead as a norm, when states abuse their own populations, we'd expect other states to say, well, that's okay, it's fine, as states used to do. I mean, I think sometimes we forget how recently it was that states could get away with this sort of thing all the time. The last time a member of the al-Assad family decided to massacre thousands of people in Syria, it received not a ripple of condemnation from the international community. So clearly that's a norm. What about the second aspect, the expectation that the international community ought to do something? Well, again, if we look at the difficult cases and the cases of most pronounced failure, we see actually there's recognition that the international community does have some responsibility. So on Syria, for example, is a very good example. You don't see the international community saying to the UN Security Council, look, we think it's fine that you're deadlocked on Syria. It's okay, fine, there's no norm there. In fact, you get the General Assembly voting in resolutions to deplore the Security Council's lack of action. So by more than a two-thirds majority in the General Assembly, you have resolutions deploring the Council and actually adopting and recommending the very measures that were vetoed down in the Security Council. And that sends a very strong signal that the international community does expect the Security Council to do more to shoulder its responsibility. Now, it's one thing to say that, and it's another thing to agree on what ought to be done. And we need to recognise that there are no easy answers. And when we look at Syria, we need to recognise that it's not as if somebody came along one day with a perfect solution to the situation in Syria that all the parties there were prepared to sign off on. The closest we got was the Kofi Annan agreement back in 2012, that was supported by the UN Security Council, but that none of the parties, neither the opposition nor the government, abided by, even though they signed up to it themselves. And in those situations, there are real limits to what the international community can achieve, and we need to be aware of those limits. And we need to be aware, as Libya showed us, that there are some ways in which international action can make things worse. Now, as the situation in Syria has gone on, the question is, well, how much worse could it get than it is now? But it could still get worse. There are neighbouring states. We know Iraq has already suffered the brunt of it, but there is also Lebanon. There's the issue of Palestine. There's serious issues of it getting worse. And also now, as the conflict has become more complex, it's become more difficult to see what outsiders can do to influence things. One of the things that's come out as a result of the rise of ISIS is actually that there was some wisdom to what the Russians were saying from the outset, which was that if you weaken Damascus, what you will get is not a new free democratic Syria, but the rise of even worse forms of extremism. And how you balance that is a difficult issue, and we need to kind of recognise that those are the sort of policy realities that are confronted. The other reason why I buck against the kind of claim that R2P is dead is that it's simply not true empirically. So the most recent indication was post-Libya, RTP was dead, and the Security Council would never again come back to RTP. And lots of academics were writing this at precisely the time that the Security Council was using RTP more often than it had ever done before. So post-Libya, the Security Council has used RTP with a much, much greater frequency than it had done prior to Libya, and has become much more comfortable using RTP. So, and the Council is also now writing RTP into its mandate, so not just noting the principle or reminding states of their primary responsibility to protect, but actually tasking UN forces in South Sudan, in Mali, in Central African Republic with supporting the goals of the responsibility to protect. So putting these principles into action. So there's a bit of a disjuncture between what a lot of analysts are talking about when it comes to RTP and where the Security Council is. And it's one of those rare situations where you can say, actually, the Security Council is a little bit ahead of the Academy on this issue.
There you go. Look, thanks so much for coming along to have a chat with us, Alex. The book is The Responsibility to Protect and Defence, available from all good bookstores, I'm sure,
or at least, ones.
or at least obscure mass online retailers. At the rate Alex produces his book, no doubt we'll be meeting with him again in a few months' time to discuss his next one. But in the meantime, thanks very much for coming along, Alex. Really appreciate it.
Cheers.